Hello there! Welcome back to Void Dwarf Studios. Today we will be looking into the world that was Warhammer Fantasy. So, yeah, this is more of a musing video, a ramble-y video, I guess. This was the first tabletop game I ever played. It's quite close to my heart, and I am cautiously optimistic that it's being revived by Games Workshop. I have a lot of questions, but I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that they know what they're doing and they're going to do the game justice. Bring it back to how it was. Or, at the very least, improve upon what was already good about Warhammer Fantasy. So, a quick explanation. I'm going to be talking about just Warhammer Fantasy in general, like what made it so cool, and how it kept GW going for years and years, and why it stopped making money, and why Games Workshop decided to end it and move on to Age of Sigmar, which, not gonna lie, when it initially came out, I was rather upset, to say the least. I had a Bretonnian army, and I wasn't happy about what happened to the Bretonnians in the end times. Oh, the end times. Haven't even explained what the end times are, have I? I'm just rambling now. The Warhammer Fantasy universe is based, I want to say, loosely upon our world, except the map is loosely based on our world. The main differences are, of course, that there is, magic, and, fantasy races. Elves, dwarves, you've got rat men, you've got vampires, you've got ogres, you've got chaos, all that loveliness, all the stuff that makes Warhammer Fantasy grim, dark and fantastic. If you really want to dig into what made Warhammer Fantasy so amazing, I would personally recommend the Gotrek and Felix series, as those two fantastic little adventurers travel around the old world and subsequently beat up some of the big nasties that you're likely to come across. Unfortunate enough to come across. So let's talk about why Warhammer Fantasy was amazing as a tabletop game. It was very tactical. You had blocks of troops and cavalry. It was very traditional in that way in a tabletop game. You move your units around. It was a lot about where you position your army and how you move it, and magic and shooting and combat were just tons of fun. They did get a bit complicated sometimes, which possibly is one of the things that people found hard to start when they were learning. I know I found it hard to learn initially, but once you got the general gist, it actually was very enjoyable. Not to mention, of course, there wasn't just troops and cavalry and, bows and arrows and guns and whatnot. There were dragons, demons, there were incredible monsters, and you had undead, and little furry rat men with miniguns, and poison grenade launchers, and, dinosaurs. Can't forget the lizard men and their dinosaurs. Oh. And talking trees. Well, they might talk to you, but they're more likely to bash you over the head. Giants. It was traditional in the sense of how the game was played, but it had such fantastical elements that just looked great on the tabletop to move around. And you could play a game within an hour or two. Well, so long as you're not playing over 2,000 points. Then that could go on for ages, depending on what armies you're playing. But here was the kicker. The thing that made Warhammer Fantasy really hard to start, and one of the reasons I think Age of Sigmar does a lot better in terms of sales, is that it's a very expensive startup cost. I looked into this a while ago when planning how much money it takes to start a new army, excluding paints and brushes and glue and all that jazz. It's easily a couple £100 just to have a average size game. And for your average 12-year-old Plus, that's kind of expensive. It's a lot to come by. Add to that the fact that it was quite a difficult game to learn and took time and practice to figure out how all the rules worked, especially in the later editions. It kind of made it very hard for new players to start. And not to mention that there were some armies where you needed ludicrous numbers of models. For example, you have the Skaven. In order to make a unit of, say, Skaven warriors useful, you had to have almost 100 of the bloody things. That was easily going to get you be 60 quid just by itself, and in terms of points, they weren't worth that much. So depending on what army you collect, it could be set not just like 200 quid, it could be 4 or 5 just to have a decent sized army. And because of this, and I think because the rules kept getting more complicated, it meant fewer people were playing the game, and subsequently sales for Warhammer Fantasy went down, and GW, for whatever reason, couldn't seem to figure out why. I mean, the fan base were screaming at them and trying to tell them what the problems were, but GW at the time just didn't particularly seem to listen. Or if it did, it never really responded. People wanted the story to progress. They wanted the rules to get a bit more streamlined and straightforward. They wanted to have more access to skirmishy games. They wanted to be able to have a lower startup cost. They wanted new lore, new units. There was a ton of things that GW could have done. Hell, my Bretonnians, I'm sorry, I'm going to probably bang on about my Bretonnians throughout this entire video, hadn't had a new army book for years. They only ever had 2 throughout the entire lifetime of the game. I think, if memory serves, the last rulebook for an army that came out were for the Wood Elves. And that was really just to start setting up things for the end times. Hell, their book series were selling better than the models, which to me is completely understandable because Warhammer Fantasy has some fantastic lore. It's such a well fleshed out world. It's got so many facets to it and so many interesting places to explore. The way magic works, for example, is explained and makes sense and is fascinating. And you've got all these fantastic races that all their different political intrigues and wars and histories behind them, each with their own distinctive personalities to them and colours, and it was just fantastic. I loved playing Warhammer Fantasy. The armies that I played were Bretonnians, I played Savage Orcs, I played Dwarves, I played... what else did I play? I started playing Vampire Counts, well, although play is a strong word. I started assembling a Vampire Count army, but this was during the end times bit, which I'll get to. So GW, in their wisdom, decided that as they weren't making money from the game, that they were going to, well, end it. And they did this via a series of books known as the End Times, which I promise I will go into more detail in another video, where chaos basically came down from the north and trounced everything in its wake. There is more to it than that. Like, there were the Rat Men, you've got various beings becoming gods, but essentially chaos came down, chaos fought, chaos wiped, and everyone died. And what this did was, well, it basically everything died. Like, every race more or less got wiped out, except for some lizard men and Skaven, and yeah, the world exploded pretty much. And yeah, everything people loved about it died, which gave birth to Age of Sigmar. And there were a lot of people who were very, very, very upset about this. Myself included. I ended up selling all my Bretonnians because I didn't think Warhammer was gonna come back. Games Workshop were quite clear that Warhammer Fantasy was over. Don't get me wrong, I actually rather enjoy Age of Sigmar now. I play several armies in it. But at the time, I was frustrated that in order to create this game, one of my favourite games had to be, well, removed. But I reckon this may have changed because of the interest in the Warhammer Total War franchise, which I play a lot as well. In fact, if you're interested, I might do a couple Let's Plays. Put a comment down there if you'd like to watch me fail miserably trying to conquer the Warhammer world. I think the interest in the Total War game actually sparked a revival of sorts. People wanted to know more about Warhammer Fantasy. They wanted to know more about the armies. People were buying more books than ever. And GW must have noticed this, or they planned for it. I wouldn't put it past them. GW's marketing team are usually pretty intelligent. And yeah, so now Games Workshop have done a 180 and they're now going to re-release Warhammer Fantasy, which from several perspectives I find both good and bad. I am happy to see the old world come back, and I would like to see the game to be, played again, or at least it to be supported by Games Workshop, and I'd love to see new models. God, I would love some new Bretonnian models, if only so I could restart the army again, because, god damn it, I loved Bretonnian knights and filthy peasants. They were so much fun to play. But I have a couple concerns. First off, in terms of play style, and also the lore, the narrative. Warhammer Fantasy was conclusively and irrevocably killed in the end times. So unless Games Workshop plan in doing a retcon, which would feel weird, because now you have Warhammer Fantasy and Age of Sigmar, a game that shares many of the same characters, which I really don't understand why. I mean, besides Sigmar, at least, I don't understand why they share the same characters. It would be a bit difficult. They've already said that they're going to have square bases, so it's not like you can just move your Age of Sigmar army between Warhammer Fantasy and back without constantly having to reglue them onto different bases. But on top of that, the play styles are worlds apart. Age of Sigmar, you've got much more freedom in how you move your models. Even though you keep them in units, they're on round bases and they're sort of in a loose formation. You've got more maneuverability that way. Warhammer Fantasy was so much about how you move, and they were in blocks. You moved everything on trays. The playstyles are so different. I don't really know how they're gonna do it, if I'm honest. And if you just brought back Warhammer Fantasy, the game as it was, you're gonna have the same problems. People are gonna be struggling to justify spending £300-400 just to play a small game. As much as I'd love Warhammer Fantasy to come back, I don't want it to come back in a half-assed kind of sense. It needs to work, and the barrier to entry needs to be lowered somehow, either through a kind of skirmish-style play. So maybe a bit like in Warbands for Warhammer Age of Sigmar, you have a skirmish-level Warhammer Fantasy game where people can, a bit like Mordheim. Oh god, I would love Mordheim to come back, or an expansion or something, because I love that game so much. I ran a campaign at my local GW store for months. I only planned for the thing to last like a couple weeks, but people enjoyed it so much that it just kept going. It ended up going for like 3-4 months. It was probably thanks to that first campaign that, I got my interest in running narrative-based games. The story to me is almost as important as the actual game itself. That was a ton of fun though. My poor Bretonnian warband led by the brave Sir Robin didn't last very long. If you know anything about Monty Python, you'll understand why he was called Sir Robin. All I'm going to say is 9 horses killed from under him. Oh god, that was hilarious. I just wanted to put my thoughts down about Warhammer Fantasy. I am cautiously optimistic. I really hope it comes back, because it would be so nice to be able to play those armies again. I just want it to be done right, and the story has to somehow make sense, which I'm very uncertain how you can make it make sense without just saying, oh, well, the end times never happened, and just restart the clock back to before Doomsday, as it were, which personally feels a bit cheap to me. I really hope GW can come up with something a bit more creative than that. But we will have to wait and see. I'm going to do a couple lore videos in the future for the Warhammer Fantasy factions. All the cool little things that makes them unique, and how chaos works and magic items and all that fun stuff. This was just my little ramble about the announcement from Games Workshop, and hoping that they will do it justice. Until next time, thank you all very much for listening. Take care, everyone.